Hello and welcome to this lesson, How to be an Online Tutor for Refugee Learners with Paul O'Keefe. The aims of this lesson are to learn the skills you need to become an online tutor for refugee learners, to discuss and explore strategies for enhancing online communication with refugees, and to gain skills to assist your students to become independent learners. Let's start by discussing what is an online tutor and what do they do. Now, perhaps some of you are engaged at a university to help other students as tutors, perhaps face-to-face in class or even online, as has happened a lot during the pandemic. Perhaps some of you are already working with refugees across an ICT platform. Perhaps your university or the organization that you work with provides support for refugee learners. So an online tutor is a person who offers those refugee learners support through pedagogy, so teaching and learning. You're a champion of refugee learners and a peer and a friend. So somebody there that really assists the students in their learning by meeting them regularly over, say, a platform like WhatsApp or other ICT platforms such as your Moodle or even Facebook. So there are many ways of connecting with students online to help them, to guide them through their learning materials, to help them, get through their course from the start to the finish, to develop their knowledge through maybe enhancing discussions on learning points, offering advice on learning, and then really guiding them to become independent learners. So tutors really are communicators, so connecting with people, they're conductors of information, and they're coaches as well to encourage the students, to motivate them, to relay new information, to get them to work together. Now, what practical issues do you need to be aware of when giving online tutoring to students? So I think you first have to know where your students are coming from. So try to find out as much information as you can about who they are, where they live, what resources are available to them, and so on. But you also need to understand your own behavior and how that can influence your communication with other people. So really, I think it's about what is your own experience of tutoring. Have you had experience where you're in a face-to-face situation with other students, or have you given online tutoring previously? Have you interacted with refugee learners? Really try to understand where they're coming from, where you're coming from, and how you can maybe troubleshoot any issues that may come about through cross-cultural communication issues and so on. So understanding the environment is also really key. A lot of the students that you'll be working with live in low-tech resource environments, so maybe they won't have access to high-speed internet. Maybe they won't have access to laptop computers, so they'll be operating through their mobile phones. So there are all of these contextual issues that you will need to be aware of. A lot of the time, there are a lot of limitations, even environmental limitations. In the camps that I used to work in, every now and then there would be massive flooding, so students couldn't physically get to the place where they could access Wi-Fi, so classes would have to be cut short. So there are all of these issues that will affect how the learning process takes place that you need to be aware of. And then couple that with cultural awareness, which can often cause trouble or cause miscommunication, let's say, or misunderstandings between people from different cultures. So yeah, we'll try to talk a little bit about that and try to find out how that can affect our own communication and how the effects of that can maybe be mitigated, the ill effects. We'll also look at the different learning styles and how that can affect how people learn and how people communicate, and especially online. And then I guess a lot of it is about managing your own expectations and managing your students' expectations, which I think is familiar to everyone who teaches. Now, so who are your students? So perhaps your students are already refugees in a refugee camp. Perhaps they're asylum seekers, so they haven't yet gained refugee status, but they've applied for it. Perhaps they're internally displaced people, so from the country they're currently physically in, but living in a different part of the country to where they're from. perhaps they're displaced migrants, perhaps they're people on the move from one country to another. So I would suggest that it's always a good idea to try to find out where the people are from, where your students are from. Try to find out a little bit about their culture, their backgrounds, maybe their experiences. And this will really help you to kind of set the pace for how communication is going to pan out throughout the course that you're teaching. And if you haven't already found that information online or through colleagues, then I would suggest you go to your course leader and try to find out as much information from them as you can. So that's pretty much the groundwork you can do, and obviously you need to put in a lot of effort researching what you're going to be teaching, what the course material is going to be, and so on. To better understand where your students are coming from, it's a good idea to try to find out some information about the refugee camp that they live in. Now, you can find a lot of general information online, such as what the process for getting asylum is, what food is available to them, how they can leave the camp if they want to, and so on. There's a lot of websites that cover this kind of information. But I suggest that you talk to your course coordinator and try to find out as much information from them as you can about life in the camp. Now, the life in the camp is often very, very official or very, very different from the official line that you will receive from the agencies. And obviously people have a different understanding of their own lives within a refugee camp. So try to maybe find out about what resources are available to them. So will the students be learning from home, or is there a learning facility that they can travel to? And if so, how do they travel? Do they get paid to travel? A lot of the time, the distances between where the people learn and where the facilities are quite long and quite dangerous to come to. And sometimes they even have to pay for this transport themselves, which really does affect people's motivation to study, and it can make things very, very difficult. You can also try to find out about what technical resources are available to them. Are they expected to buy their own mobile phone so they can connect with you online? Are there enough laptops available to them if they're going to a learning hub? Is there somebody there to provide guidance on how to use a laptop, for example? Now, all those tech things aside, I think it's very important as well to find out what scaffolding is available to them. Now, by talking about scaffolding, I mean what kind of pedagogical support is available. Is there somebody physically there to help them organize the classroom, to organize timetables for access to whatever resources are available, or any resources that are available, if there are any? And what other kind of support system is around them? For example, are there students who've already studied this course that they know and can kind of guide them, can help them? Is there a refugee management system in place that can make sure that the learning experience works pretty smoothly for them? But yes, it's a lot of this is about asking questions and really finding out about the conditions that the students live and work in. It's not so simple as you might think, where people, just get online and access a course. Because a lot of the time the resources just aren't there. They're expected, yes, to register for an online course. They're expected to study for courses that have typically been designed for Western students who live in much more privileged conditions with much better technical support, technical access, resources, and even enough food to eat during the day. Many times students will be in class during the day and they haven't eaten all day, so this may make people listless and tired and not paying full attention. So it's good to find out all of this information, and from then you can start developing a plan to assist them through your tutoring. Now, what other factors do you need to be aware of? So I think cross-cultural differences Often in refugee camps, it's very hard to pinpoint one culture because you're going to have people from many, many different countries, many different backgrounds, many different ethnic groups, and so on. So it's very hard to maybe find out about everybody's culture. But I think people really value it when you show that you've at least taken the time to understand that there are differences. Psychosocial issues are a huge issue in refugee camps. Obviously, a lot of the people are coming from traumatizing backgrounds, and even the current situations that they're living in can be very traumatizing. There can be a lot of violence, there can be a lot of abuse. The uncertainty of being a refugee and not knowing what your future is going to be, whether you have to go home or if you're going to be stuck in the camp for forever. All of these issues can play a huge impact on your psychosocial well-being. And obviously in the classroom, this has a huge ramifications. Environmental challenges are a really big concern. As I said earlier, there can be many issues relating to flooding, say in the rainy season. The temperatures can be quite extreme. It's not unheard of for people to sit in 45-degree heat with no air conditioning all day long. Other environmental issues, I guess, could go around, unhealthy waste disposal, bad sanitation, and so on. So refugee camps are generally not very nice places to live in, and they're generally very much exposed to environmental challenges that we're seeing increasing in recent years. And now the bureaucratic and administrative procedures in the camp can often very much affect lessons. It's not unheard of for students to be called to, I don't know, register for maybe resettlement. They might be called at 8 o'clock in the morning and they might be kept waiting until 6 o'clock in the evening and nothing happens. They have to come back the next day or the next day and so on. And this can really affect any planning. So I would suggest that a little bit of flexibility and understanding about the bureaucracy that refugees have to exist within as well it's a good idea to know this. Now, culture. So culture is a huge issue when teaching anyone. So really at the heart of intercultural communication, I think, is the question of how it affects ourselves personally and what we're trying to communicate. So how we teach is very much affected by our own culture and the culture of the people that we're teaching as well. And what we teach is also impacted by this. How we learn is very much influenced by our own culture, the culture around us. How we demonstrate that learning as well is very much influenced by this. So it's always good to be aware of our culture and the, I suppose, the surrounding cultures that we're interacting with. The dynamics then that influence our communication interactions are very much an important factor in refugee education. In particular, power hierarchies. I mean, we might not think that we're, within a class there are different levels of power, but there always are, and this can be extreme when you're interacting with refugees who are often at the kind of lowest power rung within the refugee system or management system. It's a good idea to note that you occupy a position of power, even though you mightn't necessarily think that, or you might not think that, or you might not want to act on that. But you do occupy a huge position of power compared to your refugee learners. So there are many factors that will affect the dynamics between you and them, and between refugees themselves, or refugees and the camp administrators. So yeah, this is a really big issue that is often kind of brushed under the carpet and maybe ignored, but it really affects people's lives and learning. To better understand culture, it's good to think about culture as an iceberg. So on the surface, you have a lot of cultural idiosyncrasies that are obvious, such as the language people use, the food they eat, the clothes they wear, and so on. And then below the surface are really the things that you don't initially see, so things that maybe aren't immediately obvious. For example, the communication style that somebody has, the way that people relate to each other, the attitudes that they hold, and so on. So things that aren't very immediately obvious, but do become more apparent with increased interaction. Now, the kind of theory that I follow when trying to explain culture, or the theorist that I think really explains it the best, is Geert Hofstede, and he pioneered these cultural dimensions. So it breaks culture down into kind of 5 main categories. So individualism versus collectivism. So some cultures are very individualistic, whereas other cultures are then more collectivistic. Power distance is another dimension. So the distance, say, between one person and, say, somebody in a position of authority. Then some cultures are more masculine or feminine. So now this relates to kind of what we have traditionally seen as typically male characteristics or typically female characteristics. Then uncertainty avoidance. This all relates to the rules that we have kind of generated in our societies. So do we follow a lot of rules? Do we have a lot of rules, but we don't necessarily follow them, and so on. And then the last dimension relates to orientation to time. So are we good timekeepers generally, or is time very relative? So we'll discuss this in much more detail now and how it relates to the intercultural classroom. So collectivism versus individualism. So this can really impact on your students' motivation and participation. Collectivistic, or students from collectivistic cultures tend to be, now not always, this is all very general, so I just want you to be aware that even within cultures there's going to be a huge variance. So generally speaking, in collectivistic cultures, students will be quite reluctant to maybe speak up in class. They don't want to maybe stand out so much, whereas in more individualistic classrooms, people will have their hands up all the time, asking questions and so on. So there's much more maybe interaction on an individual level in these classrooms. So here the example I have is in a Syrian classroom. It's much more teacher-centered, so the students maybe won't speak up so often unless they're maybe asked a direct question. Whereas in an Irish classroom, oral participation is much more prized, let's say, and students will be asking questions all the time. Then learning really happens through a lot of discussions and interactions with your classmates within these individualistic cultures. And this may not exist in other cultures which are more collectivistic. So students might tend to study quietly at home more so than in class itself. Now, this can really affect your class in terms of issues of silence. Maybe in individualistic cultures, classrooms might be a little bit more noisy. There's a lot of questioning, a lot of talking going on. Some students may perceive to be not very participatory in a collectivistic culture if they're not asking questions and you're coming from a more individualistic culture. So you might be surprised that people aren't speaking up so much. Now this can also really impact, I think, on online classrooms as well, where you might ask one question and not many people are offering an answer. People maybe kind of try to blend into the online platform rather than standing out by asking a question. Collectivistic students tend to really rely on their teacher a lot more for direction. A lot of refugee learners will have come from collectivistic countries, generally speaking, and they will have come from a more traditional educational background where the teacher is the kind of primary orchestrator of the classroom and will be maybe more reluctant to ask questions or influence the discussion topics. as well. There's a lot more kind of culture, or we're used in the West to a lot greater culture of independent learning and self-direction in teaching as well, or teaching and learning. So it's much more individualistic, whereas in certain Asian or African cultures where it's more collective, there's maybe a greater reliance on the role that the tutor or the teacher plays in kind of signposting the learning, signposting the discussions, and encouraging people. There's a lot more effort maybe needed from the teacher's side. Now, power distance and how this affects the student and the tutor's relation, or the tutor's relationship with the students. So you might notice that there is a lot of respect given to you, even though you may be the same cohort of students, the same age, the same studying the same thing as your refugee learners. They may call you by your formal title, and this is really a sign of showing respect. And this is very evident in collectivistic classrooms, where there is this respect for the tutor or the teacher as the expert. And there's very little critical engagement then, because people don't want to insult you across this line that they think is there, that they're maybe used to being there in their collectivistic classrooms. So it can be very formal. I've always found it quite difficult to adjust my own cultural practices to that, where I've come from, say, an education background where I'm used to calling the teacher by their first name, and my students are used to calling me by my first name. And it can be quite a jump to a class where somebody is calling you Mr. or Doctor this or Doctor that. And it can make me feel quite uncomfortable. So I always explain that to my students at the start and explain the difference in my culture. And, as uncomfortable it is for me, it's even more uncomfortable for them to call me by my first name. So we sometimes kind of have to negotiate that. And over time, we get to maybe a little bit of a middle ground. The masculinity versus femininity cultural dimension then refers to what Hofstede said we typically praise in, say, a masculine society, or things like competitiveness, achievement over what I guess society assumes are more feminine attributes, such as cooperation and being caring. Now, distribution of roles between the genders is a factor as well in these cultures, where certain occupations are generally occupied by men and certain occupations are generally occupied by women. It also relates to how the students' expectations of equality, leadership, figures in authority, and general gender roles within a society. Uncertainty avoidance. So this again relates to rules and regulations. So cultures of high uncertainty avoidance will try to minimize uncertainty by having a lot of rules and regulations. In low uncertainty avoidance cultures, people are much more tolerant of taking risks, and difference is maybe more prized. And there are generally a lot less rules in place. Students from high uncertainty avoidance cultures then will want clear instructions. They'll want maybe the curriculum defined well in advance of actually starting the course. They'll want to know the dates of exams, retake dates, and how many times they can take their exams. So all the rules and regulations around the course will, I think, probably should be explained very clearly anyway, whatever culture you're dealing in. But just to be aware that students from high uncertainty cultures will expect you to have this in place, whereas it might be an added bonus from students from low uncertainty cultures, where the rules are less rigid and there's more flexibility. Okay, now orientation to time. So students from this polychronic times where there's maybe a more relaxed view of what time is and things are a little bit more flexible. This can really impact on your classes. Maybe students aren't showing up to the online platform on time. Maybe they're arriving in 10, 15 minutes late and so on. whereas students from the monochronic cultures will be there waiting on the hour, waiting for you to start and expecting you to finish on time as well. Now, this can cause various issues, I guess, if you're coming from, say, a monochronic culture and you're teaching students online from a polychronic culture, in that you mightn't have enough time to devote to being more flexible, that you might be taking time out of your own studies to maybe give an online lecture or an online tutorial for 1 hour a week, and you really need students to be there on time. And you can't devote any more time than that hour that you've allocated. So I think probably the best way to get around this is to explain this at the start, and to really to show the students that yes, you do appreciate that their culture might have a different approach to timekeeping, and that yours has a different approach, but just a little bit of understanding from both sides goes a long way. Now, I do think as well it's very important to bear in mind that a lot of your students will be making that huge effort, and disruptions to their lives are quite regular, and they won't be able to mitigate a lot of that. So there are a lot of extraneous factors that will affect their timekeeping that they really have no power over. So it's always good to bear in mind that you know, they're probably doing their best, and it's something that they can't control. Now, communication styles. So everybody also has, you know, all of these different ways of communicating with people. Some people are very direct, and some people will ask pointed questions. Some people very indirect. Some cultures in particular mightn't like to ask somebody a direct question, or they might like to build up to that question as well by maybe talking about, I know my own culture, we like to, when we meet somebody, the first thing you do is you talk about the weather. So it's kind of like you ease into the conversation. So it's maybe a little bit less direct than the cultures that I've worked in. So it's important to kind of understand that, and maybe not to be confronted too drastically when somebody asks you maybe a very direct question as well. A lot of cultures are very formal, some are informal. So the use of titles, which we spoke about as well, will affect you or can affect your class. Intellectual versus relational. So is it more about like facts than the feelings of the person, which can maybe come across maybe as a little bit rude sometimes. And this is something I've noticed with students from East Africa. They can think that we're quite rude from Europe because we're sometimes very over concerned with facts rather than, you know, relating to the other person or understanding of the other person's situation. So there's a lot we can learn, I think. Abstract versus concrete. So problems again are very much approached by rules, theories, principles, rather than the details of each case. So again, it's about understanding that your approach to academia, your approach to understanding something can be very different from somebody else's. The level of emotion is very important, whether you're very invested in the topic itself, or is it something that's, you know, very factual, very abstract from your life as well. So yeah, I think it's really important to understand your own kind of communication style and your own cultural idiosyncrasies that will affect your tutoring, your communication, and also that of your students. Now, in the online classroom, so things can be a little bit different. So the idiosyncrasies that shape your own culture or that are obvious in your own culture will not maybe be as apparent as they are in a face-to-face conversation, but things like timekeeping can be very obvious. So people not showing up on time, or maybe expecting you to stay on after your tutorial has finished. The level of formality, so again, calling people by their name, by their formal titles rather than their first names. And the speech that people use can be very technical sometimes and very formal. The power dynamics as well, between you and them, between themselves, can affect who's going to be answering questions. Say if you are only using typing in the discussions, this can drag things out. Whereas if you want to maybe use, I don't know, a Zoom call, or you want to use a video, it's good to kind of mix it up. I think it's good to have different communication mediums. It's good to sometimes show some videos of yourself to make sure that people are aware that your communication style is a little bit different, even in real life. Okay, now we've sort of really a lot about, say, the cultural labels that we would expect in a refugee learning context. But what about other social groups that people are put into? For example, LGBTIQ refugees are often put into a separate category from other refugees, or students with disabilities, different gendered students, older students, and there will be maybe certain expectations by the other students upon these groups of people. You yourself might have a different expectation of who an LGBTIQ student is than a non-LGBTIQ student is, or a student with ability, with different abilities, different gender students, and so on. So it's good to understand I suppose, the labels that our societies put on us as well, rather than just the cultural differences that are at play. Have you thought about then the education culture that your class foments? I think every classroom has its own culture, and this is usually something that's built up over time. So you can maybe just have that in the back of your mind, that your own class is going to have a unique culture of its own. Students over time will maybe subscribe to that culture, or maybe they won't, and you'll subscribe to that culture. But also just to be aware of the power dynamics that will be at play in that. Positions of power, privilege, marginalization, will these be reinforced, or will you try to mitigate them somehow? So it's always great to kind of reflect on all of these factors that influence how we communicate with people from our own culture, from other cultures, because I think this is the best way that we can become the best version of the teacher or the tutor that we are, if we're really self-aware and open to open to criticism, let's say, and open to feedback and feeding forward and modifying how we communicate with people. Now, different types of learners. So really, I think there are many different ways that people learn. Some people are very visual learners, so they will expect you to maybe put a diagram on the discussion board, or they will expect a lot of images or maybe some videos. Some people are more auditory, so they would like you to maybe have links to podcasts. They would like more maybe interaction, verbal interactions, talking with them. Some people are kinesthetic learners, so they might like more role play, so they like to learn by doing. They might like to act out something in front of a camera so the whole class can see what they're doing. Some people learn best by reading and writing, so you might have to give a lot of supplementary texts on the communication platform for them to go off and read, a lot of research articles and so on. They might like a lot of written homework as well to do, writing essays and so on. But generally people are a mix of all of these, so it's always good to offer different mediums of learning. So try to mix up the communication mediums as much as you can, because I think people appreciate that, and it makes it more fun, it makes it more interesting, and you're more likely to retain students than have a lot of them fall asleep or turn off their web cameras, which I think we're all aware of as teachers, that this happens quite a bit when we're dealing online with students. Okay, now the different types of tutors. So this is very relevant, I think, for a bit more self-reflection. So are you the kind of person that is the authoritarian, the very traditional, I know best kind of person? Or are you more of a kind of facilitator, the kind of person who wants to relate to your students on a more kind of equal level? Or are you more of a demonstrator to show them how to do something? Are you a delegator, so the kind of tutor who likes to give group activities and tell people, you know, you're going to do this, and then we're going to be very project based? Or are you blended teachers? So really the kind of teacher or tutor who uses all of these different styles at different times. Um, so again, it's good to just think about this and think about what kind of role you generally occupy. But the reality is you're going to be probably a mix of all of these. But you could say most tutors are advisors. They're, as we said, they're communicators, conductors, coaches, also guiders, organizers, entertainers, participants. The likelihood is that you're going to be learning along with your students. And to be honest, I think the best way to learn is to, or to teach, or to learn is to teach. You're going to be a counselor. Your students might become very close to you and seek help, or just to even, you know, you develop a friendship over time with the students, so you get to know them. You're a corrector. Obviously, you're going to be doing a lot of that with your students. You're going to be listening to them, negotiating problems, planning future classes, and so on. So there are a lot of roles that a tutor plays. So I don't think it's ever going to be a boring job. I think it will be quite interesting. Now, meeting the challenges of online support, learning support. So I think coordinating the course is very key. You probably won't have to do as much of this as a course coordinator or course leader will have all of this organized. But I do think it's good to understand and to have a good schedule for the upcoming courses, to manage your own tutorials so the students know what's coming in the future. They'll know if there are any problems, who is the right person to go talk to, what timelines they have to respect, and so on. Communication flow, very key. So a lot of the time, communication might be stifled by poor resources, cultural differences. You might notice on your online classes that somebody drops off and hasn't been participating for a few classes. So I think at that point, it's always good to reach out to the student. Maybe it's a good idea to go to the course coordinator first and inform them what you've noticed, and ask them on the procedure. Now, this will all depend on what kind of course you're teaching or you're tutoring on. But once you've built a good relationship with your students, you'll find it much easier to reach out to the students on a personal level and ask them if there's anything you can do, or what's happening, or do they need more time, and so on. Now, encouraging autonomy is really the key, I think, when we're coming from Western education backgrounds, and we tend to prize this kind of independent learning approach. So generally, your students will want to achieve that as well. And you want to also kind of phase out their reliance on you as a tutor. So it's good to encourage them incrementally, slowly by slowly, and give them that confidence to lead the conversation themselves, rather than you having to do all the work all the time. Maybe you can get the students to take turns in leading an online class, or maybe 10 minutes exercise or something like that. So it gives people confidence, and it encourages them to become autonomous learners over time. I think be open to cultural differences is very key. There can be a lot of problems, yes, but there can be you can learn an awful lot as well. I mean, I can't even think about the many times that I've had light bulb moments where a student has said something or explained something, and like, wow, I never have thought about that, and it's really changed how I approach learning, and pedagogy in general. So I think there's a lot of bonuses to this for you. Okay, managing expectations. Again, this can be can be difficult with refugee learners. A lot of the time, the students will invest so much emotionally in education. They may even feel that what they're studying is the golden ticket to get out of the situation that they're in. And unfortunately, it's not a lot of the time. I think it's very important to be clear to your students that maybe if they're studying a law course, they're not going to be lawyers when they finish a 12-week course. That explain to them the process, the pathway that they're going to go on, and the value of the course that they're studying. Um, and I can understand why somebody would be very extremely motivated in living in those conditions to study. I mean, often it's the only hope a lot of people have for a better life. So there tends to be an over inflated expectation of what studying can bring them. Um, so we don't want people to be too disappointed. So it's very important to be open and honest that yes, education can bring all the wonderful things, but it's always a long process. And it's about opening doors a lot of the time. So I don't want to dampen anybody's hopes, but I also don't want somebody to be too let down by the end of the learning experience if their dreams aren't immediately coming true. Motivation, just on that note, can be really hard to maintain when your students have been very much let down by a system that has maybe kept them in very difficult circumstances. They mightn't have enough electricity, or there aren't resources there. They might be very hungry. They might have had to give up the jobs that they have to attend your classes, which has a huge impact on their families and their lives in general. So it can be very hard to maintain motivation. Um, but again, I think your job as a tutor is to try to encourage that motivation. You are maybe the entertainer a lot of the time, and I think people enjoy that. People learn best when they're laughing and they're feeling comfortable with who they're learning with. So it's good to try to big up people, tell them they're doing a great job, tell them to keep up the fight, and really try to maintain their motivation. And also you, because I think maybe if you're coming from a non-refugee background, it's maybe the first time you've ever heard of some terrible things that people have gone through. It can be very emotionally difficult. Um, but I think it's a wonderful thing to do, and you're going to make wonderful friends for life. And it's going to change the way you think about teaching and learning. And I think it's really something that you can think about if you are losing motivation. Maybe a lot of your students aren't showing up to class, but one or two of them are, and they're really invested in it. So I hope you'll remember that if times maybe get a little bit tough in your classes, that one or two people, really, it means the world to them that you're showing up and you're connecting with them and you're helping them and they're helping you. Okay, so a little bit more practical here then, planning in advance. So as we know, things always go wrong, especially when we're learning online in these contexts. There may be a flood, there may be no internet, there may be a riot, there may be some terrible things happen. So it's always a good idea to have a plan B and don't just rely on a stable internet connection. Maybe you want to have a physical copy of the notes that you can email to the students after a class as well. So yeah, good. Plan in advance. Now, so I think let's just talk a little bit about how do you get started again. So again, it's about familiarizing yourself with who you're teaching and what you're teaching. Maybe before you start your first class, you can organize a little video of yourself as a tutor just to introduce yourself so they see what you look like and they see how you interact. I have two of my students here, Yanis and Thibaut, who made a short little video for their students in Kakuma refugee camp a few years ago. And I'll play it for you so you can
Hi,
see
welcome
what
to
they say.
the module 3. It's a case-based learning module. So on this module, you will learn how to reasoning and analyzing a critical medical case. So I'm Thibault Lovert, I'm a med student, and
My name is Petunia, and I'm a med student too, and I'm really happy to work with you.
and we are both living in Geneva, and we are really happy to work with you on that project.
Okay, great. So you can see the guys there, they just made a short little video telling them a little bit about the course, a little bit about themselves, and it really helped to break the ice. So their students in Kenya received this on a WhatsApp forum, and then their students did the same about themselves. Now, there was no expectation that the students in Kenya would make a video of themselves, because a lot of the time refugee learners won't want to share such information, or they won't want their images available online, for example. But their students did this, and I think it really helped to break the ice from the start. And the students in Kenya could see that the tutors in Geneva were the same age as them, and just maybe the same way of acting as well. So it was good. It really helped to break the ice, and people became fast friends. And it really helps to get to know your students from the start.
Hi,
Whoops,
welcome.
here we go. Okay, so then some communication tips. So how you can improve your own communication, I think, is prepare and be flexible. Give clear learning outcomes from the start with instructions for each class. Converse face-to-face as much as you can. Prepare as much videos as you can. I think online learning can be so difficult for everyone. But when you personalize it, it really does work a lot better than when it's just a generic online course. Speak slowly and clearly. A lot of the time your students are coming from or have, maybe this is their English is their fourth or fifth language or more even. They do appreciate the opportunity to learn in English, or whether you're speaking in French or whatever your language, but it won't be their native language often, so it's good to enunciate pretty well. Repeat your questions, maybe if somebody doesn't understand, rather than rephrasing, especially for English as a second language learners, because they won't maybe have enough time in their mind to translate the rephrasing. So if you repeat, it's going to make it easier for them. Use issues of silence then. So giving people enough time rather than jumping in with an answer. It's good if you give them a few seconds to come back with an answer. Let people become comfortable with what you're asking, and then they can internalize what they're thinking and the question or the answer that they want to give. Understand that everyone learns differently. So some people will learn visually, some people will learn through hearing, and so on. So it's a good idea to mix up the mediums of communication as much as you can. Use pictures, use podcasts, use discussions, whatever you can get your hands on, I think, to put on the learning platform. You're going to reach more people and more people in different ways, and that will be most helpful. Encourage engagement, I think, is really key too. It's good to motivate people by really encouraging them and bigging them up, and acknowledging if they've done something well. People appreciate that. Try to have fun. It's not always that helpful when you're a serious teacher, and people might be a little bit intimidated by that. So it's good to have a lighthearted mood, I think, and really to connect on a friendship level with your students. I think it'll transform the tutorials into something really productive. Try to get as much feedback from your students as you can. Maybe at the end of each tutorial, you can ask them one thing that worked for them, one thing that didn't work for them, and how you could change things for the next tutorial, or what they'd like to study in particular. So being very open to the feedback really helps for that, and open to maybe modifying your own approach. Also connecting with your colleagues and asking them for any tips and how they would improve things themselves. Now, so that's about it. So thank you very much. I hope you've found it useful. There's a list of articles I've produced here on my own research into online tutoring that you can access. These are all open source. If you want to find out more, or if anything isn't clear for you, or you want to give some feedback, you can contact me at the email address below, and I'll be really happy to hear from you. So